back to make sure he heard that question correctly and changed his answer on it. That question to him by Jackie Heinrich, our reporter at the White House. Also with me, retired four-star General Jack Keane, chairman of the Institute for the Study of War and Fox News senior strategic analyst. General, good to have you with us. I guess before we get into the state of what's going on today, what's your reaction to the president calling Vladimir Putin a war criminal?
Well, that's what he is, and we've got to identify the people who are executing his war crimes as well. All those generals out there that are killing these innocent Ukrainian people, they've got to be named. And I think the Congress of the United States is fully intended to do just that. So that's very important. Listen, certainly Putin is insulated as a head of state from ever being tried to a certain degree. He's certainly not going to go to any court and throw himself on the mercy of the court. But they'll put pressure on those generals for sure. And that needs to be done because they're a conservative lot and they're not used to being named and facing the media and the public the way Putin is.
Okay, let's put up on the screen President Zelensky's requests this morning. He gave an impassioned plea to members of the United States Congress, and these are the things that he asked for. The list includes no-fly zone, and if not that, then S-300 surface-to-air missile systems. He asked for all American companies to leave Russia and to not allow Russian goods to enter American ports, among other things. Your thoughts on what we heard from Zelensky and also from President Biden today, General?
Well, I certainly agree with the specific requests he made, but President Zelensky, that was a very powerful, emotional plea to the American people, talking to their representatives. I mean, he managed to connect the values of Ukraine with the values of America, and then also reminded us that America's values were attacked very significantly in Pearl Harbor and on 9/11 as Ukraine people are being attacked. And that video, that was a gripping video. You can't watch that without feeling the pain of the Ukrainian people. And I think what he managed to do there was connect their extraordinary suffering, and he wanted to connect it with the compassion and generosity and heart of the American people. And then I loved his ending. He pinned the rose on the president. He looked at him and he said, "You're the leader of the nation. I want you to be the world leader." And what he is saying to him, he wants him to step up and end this suffering of the Ukrainian people. Help me to defeat the Russians and end this thing. And President Biden has never really embraced it like that. He's never said, this is not going to stand. I'm going to do everything in my power to help the Ukrainians defeat the Russians and get the Russians out of Ukraine. We are going to save Ukraine. Those words or words like them have never come out of his mouth. He said something to the effect we're going to strengthen the Ukrainians' resistance. Words to that effect. Not enough. But listen, I am encouraged by what the president is providing here. What I'm looking at, Martha, what is killing the Ukrainian people? Bombs from airplanes, missiles from airplanes, and artillery and mortars. That is and rocket artillery as well. That's what's killing them. So he's going to get more Stingers, and he said, without specificity, he said longer range air defense systems. If that's S-300s, as President Zelensky is requesting, that is excellent. Just last night, the S-300 systems that they have in the vicinity of Kyiv took down some aircraft that would have dropped more bombs on Kyiv. So this is very important, and it's absolutely critical for dealing with this. Certainly the Stinger missiles that they're providing also will be of help, but that's only for aircraft that are flying at low altitude. The aircraft that are flying at higher altitude, you need those sophisticated air defense systems. Artillery and rocket and tube artillery are killing the Ukrainian people. He mentioned, I believe, he said radars. And what he's talking about, I'm hoping, is counter-battery radars that can detect the artillery as it's firing, and that gives the Ukrainians the ability to fire back on it very accurately and destroy those systems. That is crucial. Armed drones are also crucial in this fight. And then in dealing with the Ukraine military, I mean, those anti-tank systems, and he named there's a number of them on that shopping list that are also very important. Just last night, Martha, north of Kyiv, in the suburbs of Kyiv, the Ukrainian military took back 2 small towns during the night with their night vision goggles on, and for some bizarre reason, the Russians do not have theirs with them, or I'm not certain what is going on as part of their overall incompetence. But these weapon systems are absolutely crucial for the Ukrainians. And they understand fighting. They don't understand what morale and will is. It's not just about absorbing and fighting back when somebody's attacking you. They are countering an attack against them. And now actually took small pieces of territory back, not decisive, not particularly significant, but nonetheless sends a huge message in terms of their own will and capabilities.
Well, their mission and their drive is unmistakable. And I believe the president used the words he wanted to give them what they needed to put them in a position to continue today, not the words that you were looking for in terms of helping them to complete this mission, to push Putin out of their country. We have not heard that yet. General, thank you very much. It's great to have you with us, as always. Thank you, sir.